My dad said, "Stay outside until you learn respect." Then he shut the door in my face. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just stood there on the porch of our house on Willow Ridge Drive, staring at the wood grain of a door I had walked through every day of my life. Inside, I could hear laughter, glasses clinking, my stepmother's bright, polished voice telling someone, "Teenagers can be so dramatic." I'm 21, not a teenager, but in that moment, I felt about 9. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Not freezing, just sharp. Sharp like humiliation. Through the window, I saw my dad lift his glass and smile like nothing had happened. I told myself he would open the door in a minute. He always liked making a point, but he didn't. Then headlights swept slowly across the front lawn. A black Rolls-Royce stopped at the curb. The rear door opened, and my grandfather stepped out. People think control starts with shouting. It doesn't. It starts with small corrections, with sighs, with sentences like, "That's not how we do things in this family." My name is Avery Collins. I'm 21 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was the difficult one. My mom died when I was 9. Brain aneurysm. Sudden. Random. The kind of tragedy that makes adults whisper in kitchens and hug you too tightly at funerals. I remember my grandfather, Grandpa Will, holding my shoulders afterward and saying, "You call me anytime, day or night." His voice had been steady, certain. 2 months later, we moved. New town, new house, new phone number. When I asked for Grandpa's address, Dad said, "He needs space." And so do we. I believed him. I believed everything back then. Heather came into our lives a year later. She had perfect posture and a way of smiling that showed all her teeth but never quite reached her eyes. Her daughter, Madison Maddie, was 2 years older than me and effortlessly confident. She walked into rooms like they already belonged to her. "Fresh start," Heather said the first night she slept over. "Isn't that exciting?" Exciting wasn't the word I would have chosen. At first, nothing obvious changed. Dad still packed my school lunches. He still asked about my grades. But gradually, the language shifted. "Avery, could you help Heather with the dishes?" "Avery, why don't you let Maddie have that seat?" "Avery, it would mean a lot if you didn't make things harder." Harder. I didn't know what that meant. I just knew I didn't want to be the reason anything was harder. When Maddie wanted my bedroom, the one with the bay window and the built-in bookshelf my mom had painted white, Heather explained it gently. "Maddie needs the natural light for studying," she said. "You're such a flexible girl, Avery. You won't mind the smaller room." The smaller room was technically an office. Narrow window, slanted ceiling, a desk bolted to the wall. I told myself it was temporary. It wasn't. Over time, family dinners became performances. Maddie talked about cheerleading. Heather talked about charity events. Dad talked about work. When I tried to add something about my art class or a book I loved, the conversation tilted away from me like I'd tipped the table. "You're overthinking," Dad would say when I brought it up later. "No one is excluding you." But exclusion doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just space, empty chairs, unanswered texts, a quiet sense that your presence is tolerated, not wanted. When I turned 18, I got into a state university 2 hours away. I was proud, terrified, hopeful. Dad barely looked up from his laptop. "That's far," he said. "Community college here would be more practical." Heather nodded. "Family stays close, Avery." Maddie had already decided to take a gap year. Dad paid for her car, for her trip to Miami, for her self-discovery. I got a part-time job at a coffee shop to cover my books. "You're very independent," Heather told guests once, like it was a compliment. Avery likes doing things on her own. I did things on my own because I had learned something important. If I needed less, I caused less trouble. By the time I was 21 and back home after graduation, I had perfected invisibility. I cooked without being asked. cleaned before anyone noticed a mess, smiled at jokes that weren't funny. Dad liked to talk about respect. Respect is earned, he'd say, usually when I questioned something small. And in this house, respect starts with obedience. Obedience. It's an interesting word when you're already an adult. The night of the party, the night he told me to stay outside, it wasn't the first time I'd been made to feel small. It was just the first time someone powerful enough to change everything saw it happen. And he wasn't smiling. The party was Dad's idea. Regional director, he announced 2 weeks earlier, holding up a bottle of champagne like he'd personally invented ambition. That deserves a proper celebration. Heather immediately started planning. Guest list, catering ideas, floral arrangements. Maddie volunteered to curate the playlist so it doesn't feel dated. No one asked what I thought. 3 days before the event, Heather handed me a clipboard. "You're so organized, Avery. Could you handle the food logistics? Just the appetizers and dessert table. I trust you." Trust. It sounded warm, supportive, almost kind. In reality, it meant I would be in the kitchen for most of the evening. The night arrived polished and bright. Willow Ridge Drive glowed with porch lights and quiet wealth. Cars lined the curb: Mercedes, Lexus, a glossy navy BMW that Maddie kept admiring through the window. Inside, our house smelled like rosemary and sugar. I had been cooking since noon. Mini crab cakes, caprese skewers, chocolate mousse in small glass cups that I washed and re-wiped twice because Heather liked things spotless. Dad came downstairs in a tailored navy suit. He adjusted his cufflinks in the hallway mirror. "You look nice," I said. He nodded once. "Let's keep everything smooth tonight, okay?" Smooth. That word again. Code for don't disrupt. By 7, the doorbell hadn't stopped ringing for 15 minutes. Laughter spilled in with every guest. Coats were draped over the staircase railing. Heather's voice floated through the foyer like she owned the air. "Avery, honey, bring out the first tray." I did. 25 guests filled the living room. Bank executives, their spouses, a couple from the neighborhood association. Mrs. Thompson from next door stood near the fireplace, clutching a glass of white wine. Dad had become magnetic. He shook hands, clapped backs, told the story of his promotion like it had been a battle won. "And my daughter Maddie," he said at one point, gesturing toward her in a red silk dress. "She's interning with a marketing firm this summer. Bright future." Maddie smiled like she'd rehearsed it. No one mentioned me. I moved quietly between conversations, refilling drinks, clearing plates. A woman I didn't recognize stopped me near the kitchen. "Oh, you must be the caterer," she said pleasantly. I smiled. "No, I live here." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh," she turned back to her conversation. Around 8:30, everyone migrated toward the dining area. Heather had arranged place cards with careful calligraphy. I scanned the table. Daniel Collins, Heather Collins, Madison Collins, Mr. and Mrs. Langford, Mr. Patel, Mrs. Thompson. There was no card for me. I checked again. Slower this time. Nothing. For a moment, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe Heather forgot. Maybe there was an extra chair somewhere. Dad caught my eye across the room. "Everything good?" he asked lightly. "Where am I sitting?" I asked. He blinked, as if the question itself were strange. "In the kitchen, probably. You'll be busy with dessert, right?" I swallowed. "I already prepped everything." Heather appeared beside him, smiling too brightly. "Sweetheart, don't make this awkward. You're helping tonight. We talked about this." We hadn't. I felt 25 sets of eyes nearby, listening without looking like they were listening. I started, keeping my voice steady. "I just wanted to know if I was part of the dinner." Silence doesn't fall all at once. It spreads. Dad's jaw tightened. "Not with that tone," he said quietly. "I don't have a tone." Heather gave a soft, wounded laugh. "See? This is what I meant earlier." "Earlier?" Dad set his glass down on the table. The sound was deliberate. "Avery," he said. his voice lowering into the one he used when issuing final decisions. If you can't be supportive tonight, you don't need to be in here. Supportive. Of what? My own erasure? I cooked all of this, I said before I could stop myself. And we appreciate that, Heather replied quickly. But appreciation doesn't excuse disrespect. There it was again. Disrespect. The word floated around the room like smoke. Heavy. Accusing. Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably near the edge of the group. No one else moved. Dad stepped closer. Close enough that only I could hear the next sentence clearly. Go cool off, he murmured. We'll talk later. Talk about what? I asked. His expression hardened. You always have to push. And that was the moment I realized something important. It didn't matter how calm I sounded. It didn't matter that I wasn't yelling. The problem wasn't my tone. The problem was that I had spoken at all. Dad reached for my arm, not violently, just firmly enough to guide me toward the foyer. Daniel, Heather whispered, half warning, half performance. It's fine, he said. The front door opened. Cool night air rushed in. And before I could process what was happening, I heard the words that would echo in my head for months afterward. Stay outside until you learn respect. The door closed. The lock clicked. Inside, conversation resumed. Outside, I stood alone on the porch, staring at the wood grain of the door. For a second, I thought he would open it again. He didn't. And that's when the headlights appeared at the end of Willow Ridge Drive. For the first 30 seconds, I didn't move. I just stood there on the porch, staring at the door like it might change its mind. The night air was sharp, but not brutal. Late October in Brookhaven, cool enough to make you hug yourself, not cold enough to justify drama. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went quiet. The porch light hummed faintly above me. Inside, I could hear the party recovering, a ripple of laughter, the clink of silverware. Heather's voice soft, apologetic, carefully pitched. I'm so sorry about that, she was saying. Avery's been overwhelmed lately. Overwhelmed. I pressed my palm against the door, not pounding, just touching it, as if it were warm. I told myself this was temporary, a tactic. Dad liked to demonstrate authority. He liked an audience when he did it. He would let me stand out here long enough to prove a point, then open the door and say something about reflection. He had done versions of this before. Take a minute, he'd say. Think about your attitude. Come back when you're ready to be respectful. Respect always meant silence. Through the window beside the door, I could see part of the dining table. Dad had already returned to his seat. He was smiling, again, controlled, practiced, the version of him that impressed boards and committees. He lifted his glass. To resilience, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Resilience. Heather laughed lightly. We all need a little patience in family life, don't we? A few guests murmured agreement. My chest tightened not from cold, but from something heavier. Mrs. Thompson stood near the archway to the kitchen. She glanced toward the door. Our eyes met for half a second. She looked away first. No one came. I stepped back from the door and wrapped my arms around myself. The porch boards creaked under my weight. My bare feet felt the chill through thin flats I hadn't meant to wear outside. Humiliation has a temperature. It settles between your shoulder blades and spreads outward. I thought about going around to the side entrance. I thought about knocking loudly enough to interrupt the toast. I imagined walking back into the dining room and saying, clearly, calmly, "You locked me out!" But I knew how that would end. See, Heather would say softly. This is exactly what we're talking about. Dad would shake his head. A few guests would exchange looks. The narrative would tighten around me like a rope. I was difficult. I was dramatic. I was ungrateful. I stared down the quiet street instead. Willow Ridge Drive was lined with identical houses, white siding, black shutters, manicured hedges that suggested order and prosperity. It was the kind of neighborhood where people measured success by driveway space. And right now, I was standing outside mine. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Inside, music started playing. Something upbeat. Something that said, "Nothing happened here." My phone buzzed in my pocket. For one hopeful second, I thought it might be Dad. It was Maddie. "You're being embarrassing. Just apologize." I stared at the message. Apologize for what? For asking where I sat at my own table? For wanting to exist in a room I helped prepare? Another message. "Dad's stressed. Don't ruin this for him." Ruin. The word settled over me like frost. I typed a reply, erased it, typed again, erased again. Finally, I slid the phone back into my pocket without responding. The house behind me glowed warm and golden. Through the side window, I could see Heather leaning toward a guest, whispering something confidential and concerned. Dad nodded solemnly, as if enduring something noble. The story was being written without me. I stepped off the porch and onto the walkway, just far enough to breathe without feeling the door at my back. Gravel crunched under my shoes. Across the street, curtains shifted. Mrs. Thompson's porch light flicked on. I swallowed hard. Maybe this was what respect really meant in my father's world. Not kindness. Not fairness. Compliance. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry. I would not give them that image, the dramatic daughter sobbing on the lawn. I lifted my chin. "I'm not wrong," I whispered to myself. The words felt strange, foreign. I had spent years adjusting my reactions, smoothing my edges, lowering my voice. Years convincing myself that maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe love was supposed to feel conditional. Inside, the music got louder. Dad's voice rose above it again. "Let's move to dessert." Dessert. The mousse I had made. The tray I had arranged. The spoons I had polished. I almost laughed. The irony was almost elegant. That's when the distant glow of headlights appeared at the end of the street. Slow. Low. Intentional. Not the quick turn of a neighbor pulling into a driveway. Not the erratic beam of someone lost. This light moved like it belonged. The engine sound reached me a second later, deep, controlled, expensive. The car turned onto Willow Ridge Drive and glided forward, black paint reflecting porch lights like liquid glass. It didn't hesitate. It didn't circle. It stopped directly in front of our house. The Rolls-Royce emblem caught the light. The driver stepped out first, adjusting his coat. Then he moved to the rear passenger door and opened it. My heartbeat slowed instead of sped up. Because somehow, before I even saw him, I knew. A polished shoe touched the pavement, then another. And my grandfather, William Bennett, straightened to his full height under the streetlight. He looked at me first. Not the house. Not the car. Me. His eyes traveled from my face to the closed front door behind me. He didn't smile. He didn't rush. He just took in the scene with the kind of stillness that makes rooms quiet without a word being spoken. Then he asked, in a voice that carried easily across the yard, "Why are you standing outside, Avery?" And for the first time that night, I didn't feel small. For a second, I couldn't answer him. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I hadn't expected anyone to ask. Grandpa Will stepped fully onto the pavement, the porch light catching the silver at his temples. He wore a charcoal overcoat, tailored and precise, like everything about him. Behind him, the driver stood respectfully near the car, hands folded. The Rolls-Royce idled quietly at the curb, engine almost silent. It didn't look flashy. It looked certain. Grandpa's eyes softened when they met mine. "Avery," he said again, more gently. "Why are you out here?" I swallowed. Dad said I need to learn respect. His gaze shifted slowly to the front door. The music from inside drifted through the glass. Laughter. The faint clink of cutlery. The evening continuing without interruption. "I see," he said. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't look confused. He just understood. "How long?" he asked. "Long enough." He nodded once. Controlled. Measured. Then he glanced up at the house, studying it the way someone studies an investment portfolio. "Is everyone inside?" he asked. "Yes." "Guests?" About 25. He exhaled through his nose. Not anger. Calculation. Avery? He said quietly, stepping closer. Did he put his hands on you? No, I answered quickly. He just directed me. Grandpa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Directed, he repeated. The porch light flickered slightly in the breeze. The air between us felt steadier than it had all night. I hadn't seen my grandfather in 12 years. Not in person. I'd heard about him, of course. Or rather, I'd heard my father's version of him. He's controlling. He only cares about money. He doesn't approve of our choices. He chose pride over family. Eventually, the stories became facts in my mind. I stopped asking why he never called. He stepped onto the walkway now, standing beside me instead of in front of me. We faced the house together. Did he tell you I didn't want you? Grandpa asked, quietly. I hesitated. Yes. Grandpa didn't react dramatically. He didn't scoff. He simply nodded once, like a man confirming a suspicion he'd carried for years. I thought so. He turned toward the car slightly and made a small gesture with his hand. The driver opened the trunk and removed a slim leather briefcase. My pulse ticked upward. Grandpa, I said carefully. What are you doing here? He glanced at me sideways. You didn't think I stopped looking, did you? The words hit me harder than the cold air had. Dad said you needed distance. Grandpa's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of grief, of restrained frustration. Avery, he said softly. There's a difference between distance and silence, and I was never silent. My chest tightened. Before I could respond, the front door opened. Heather stood in the doorway, her smile already in place. Oh, she said brightly, glancing between us. We didn't realize we had company. Dad appeared behind her a second later. His posture stiffened the instant he recognized the man on the porch. William? No warmth, no surprise, just tension wrapped in politeness. Daniel? Grandpa replied calmly. The music inside faltered, someone lowering the volume instinctively. Heather's eyes darted to the car at the curb, then back to Grandpa. Is everything all right? She asked. Grandpa turned slightly toward her, measured and composed. That depends, he said, on whether my granddaughter is being asked to stand outside as part of tonight's entertainment. Heather blinked. Oh no, there must be some misunderstanding. Avery was just learning respect. Grandpa finished smoothly. Dad stepped forward, filling the doorway. This is a family matter, he said firmly. There's no need for theatrics. Grandpa's gaze never left him. I agree, he said. Family matters deserve clarity. Dad's jaw flexed. You've made your point, he said to me. You can come back inside now. I looked at him. Just 10 minutes ago, I had been invisible. Now, under my grandfather's presence, I was suddenly permitted. Grandpa glanced at me briefly, then back at Dad. Before she does, he said evenly, we need to address something. The driver stepped forward and handed Grandpa the briefcase. Heather's polished smile faltered slightly. Address what, exactly? Dad asked. Grandpa opened the case slowly, deliberately, revealing a neat stack of documents secured with a silver clip. The property at 14 Willow Ridge Drive, he said. Dad's eyes sharpened. What about it? Grandpa held up the first document, not dramatically, just enough for the porch light to catch the header. The deed? He said. The air changed. Not loud, not explosive, just heavier. Inside, a few guests had drifted toward the foyer, curiosity overriding etiquette. Mrs. Thompson stood just behind Heather now, peering around her shoulder. Dad's voice dropped lower. You're not doing this here. Grandpa met his gaze without blinking. You're right, he said calmly. You started it here. Silence stretched across the porch. Heather shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, maybe we should... Dad cut her off. This house is mine. Grandpa's eyes flicked down to the paper, then back up. Is it? The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. For the first time that night, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face, and the door behind him, once a barrier, suddenly looked like a threshold. The porch had become a stage. Only now, my father wasn't directing it. Grandpa didn't step inside. He didn't need to. He stood at the threshold, framed by the doorway, and let the silence build around him. "Daniel," he said evenly, "this property was purchased in 2002 through the Bennett Family Trust." Dad's expression hardened. "You're mistaken." Grandpa didn't argue. He simply removed a document from the folder and handed it to him. "I don't make statements I can't substantiate." Dad didn't take it at first. Heather leaned forward, trying to glance at the page without appearing to do so. "What exactly are you implying?" she asked carefully. Grandpa looked at her politely. "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Collins. I'm clarifying." Inside, a few guests had fully turned toward the foyer now. Conversations had stalled. Someone near the dining table whispered, "What's going on?" Grandpa continued. "When my daughter Avery's mother passed away, the trust remained active. The assets allocated to her were not dissolved. They were protected." Dad finally took the document. His hands were steady, but his jaw wasn't. "That was 20 years ago," he said. "We've lived here since." "Yes," Grandpa replied. "You have." The distinction hung between them. Lived. Not owned. The driver, who I now realized wasn't just a driver, stepped forward slightly. "This is Mr. Carter Hayes," Grandpa said calmly. "Trust attorney." Mr. Hayes gave a small nod. "Good evening." Dad's eyes flicked to him. "You brought a lawyer to my house?" "No," Grandpa corrected gently. "I brought documentation." Heather's voice tightened. "Daniel, what is he talking about?" Dad didn't answer her. Grandpa's gaze shifted to me briefly, just long enough to anchor me. Then back to my father. "The title has never transferred out of the trust," he said. "And the trust's primary beneficiary became Avery upon her mother's passing." The room inside went very, very quiet. "Beneficiary?" Heather repeated faintly. Dad exhaled sharply. "That's not how this works." Mr. Hayes spoke calmly. "Actually, Mr. Collins, that is precisely how it works." Dad looked down at the paper in his hand, scanning quickly. I could see the moment he found the signature line, the official seal. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, voice lowering into something more urgent. "In front of people?" Grandpa's expression didn't change. "You locked my granddaughter outside. That's not the point." "It is exactly the point." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Heather stepped forward now, abandoning composure. "This is ridiculous. Daniel has paid every mortgage payment, every tax bill, every repair." Grandpa nodded once. "And the trust has records of each reimbursement." Heather blinked. "Reimbursement?" "Yes," Mr. Hayes said. "The trust covered the principal. Mr. Collins covered utilities and maintenance." Dad's face flushed. "That was understood," he said tightly. "By whom?" Grandpa asked. The question hit like a gavel. Inside, Mrs. Thompson shifted her weight. Someone near the staircase cleared their throat. Maddie appeared behind Heather now, confusion plain across her face. "Dad?" she whispered. Grandpa continued calmly, as though explaining market trends at a board meeting. "The trust terms require that the property remain protected for the beneficiary. That beneficiary is Avery." My pulse thundered in my ears. I hadn't known. Not about any of it. Dad looked at me for the first time since the confrontation began. "Avery," he said, voice softening slightly. "You don't understand what's happening." Grandpa turned his head slowly toward him. "Then explain it." Dad hesitated. Heather stepped in quickly. "This is manipulation. William, you've always tried to control things with money." Grandpa's eyes settled on her. "This isn't control," he said evenly. "This is accountability." Mr. Hayes reached into the folder again and withdrew another stack. "And these," he added calmly, "are certified delivery records." Dad's expression changed. Not anger. Recognition. "Avery," Grandpa said gently, Did you receive birthday cards from me? The question caught me off guard. No. Christmas packages? No. Letters. I shook my head slowly. Grandpa didn't look surprised. Mr. Hayes laid the stack on the foyer table. Each envelope bore a red stamp. Return to sender. 72 documented attempts, he said quietly. Over 12 years. Heather's face drained of color. Maddie stared at the envelopes like they were radioactive. Dad's voice cracked slightly. You don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Hayes didn't raise his tone. All correspondence was mailed to this address. Grandpa looked at my father. Not angry, just resolute. You told her I abandoned her. Dad's eyes flicked toward the watching guests. This isn't the time. You chose the time, Grandpa replied. Silence filled the doorway. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Not dramatically, not violently, but undeniably. Dad took a step toward me. Avery, sweetheart, he said, adopting a gentler tone. This is bigger than you think. He's trying to divide us. Divide us. I looked at the front door behind him, the door that had closed in my face 15 minutes earlier. You divided us, I said quietly. The words didn't shake. They landed. Heather inhaled sharply. Maddie whispered, Dad. Grandpa stepped slightly to the side, giving me space instead of speaking for me. That door, I continued, my voice steadier than I expected, closed before he arrived. Dad stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. You embarrassed me, he said. I asked for a seat at my own table. Heather tried to regain footing. Avery, we love you. You're overreacting. Love doesn't lock doors, Grandpa said calmly. The room absorbed that sentence. Mr. Hayes closed the folder with a soft click. Under the trust's review clause, he said, occupancy arrangements may be reassessed in the event of conduct detrimental to the beneficiary. Dad's head snapped toward him. You're not serious. Grandpa's gaze never wavered. I am. The weight of it settled slowly. This wasn't shouting. This wasn't chaos. It was structural, legal, unavoidable. Heather looked between them rapidly, calculating. What does that mean? She demanded. Mr. Hayes replied evenly. It means that the trustee will evaluate whether the current residents are acting in the beneficiary's best interest. Dad's composure cracked for the first time. You'd throw us out? He asked. Grandpa didn't answer immediately. He looked at me. Not asking, not instructing, just acknowledging. Then he turned back to my father. You chose to put her outside. The implication hung heavy in the air. You put her out. Now you might have to leave. No threats. Just symmetry. The music inside had long since stopped. 25 guests stood in various stages of discomfort, none daring to interrupt. Maddie's voice was small now. Dad, is the house really hers? The question pierced something in him. He didn't answer her. Grandpa closed the briefcase gently. Avery, he said softly, you don't stand outside doors that were built for you. My throat tightened. Dad looked between us. Desperation creeping in. Avery, he said again. Don't do this. I realized something in that moment. I wasn't doing anything. I hadn't orchestrated the paperwork. I hadn't summoned the car. I hadn't even known the truth. All I had done was ask for respect. And someone powerful enough to enforce it had shown up. Grandpa extended his hand to me. Not to pull. Just to offer. Would you like to come inside? He asked calmly. Or would you prefer to leave with me? The choice, for the first time in years, was mine. For a long moment, no one moved. The house that had always felt like a fixed structure, solid, immovable, unquestioned, suddenly felt fragile, like something resting on paperwork instead of certainty. Dad looked at me as if I held a detonator. Avery, he said, lowering his voice, trying to shrink the moment back into something private. Let's go inside. We can talk about this without an audience. An audience. That was the word he used. As if I had created a scene instead of simply being placed in one. Heather stepped forward quickly, tone shifting from defensive to diplomatic. "This doesn't need to escalate," she said. "William, surely we can sit down and discuss this like adults." Grandpa's expression remained composed. "I am discussing it like an adult," he replied. Maddie hovered behind them, visibly unsettled. She wasn't cruel. Not really. She had just benefited from a structure that never required her to question it. "Dad?" she said softly. "Is it true?" Dad ran a hand through his hair, a tell I hadn't seen in years. It was what he did when control slipped. "It's complicated," he muttered. Mr. Hayes spoke evenly, filling the silence. "It isn't." The word echoed louder than anything shouted that night. Complicated was emotional. Legal wasn't. Heather's posture straightened slightly. I could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes. "If the trust owns the property," she said carefully, "that doesn't mean Daniel hasn't contributed." "No one has denied his contributions," Grandpa said. "But contribution is not ownership." Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat softly behind them. The sound seemed to ripple through the room like a reminder. People were watching. Dad noticed it too. He straightened his jacket and attempted to recover his tone. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said to me quietly. "Is this what you want? To humiliate your own father?" The old script? Guilt, loyalty, shame. For a split second, it almost worked, but then I remembered the click of the deadbolt. "I didn't humiliate you," I said calmly. "You made a choice." The words felt foreign but right. Grandpa didn't interrupt. He didn't speak for me. He simply stood beside me. Heather inhaled sharply. "This is absurd. Daniel has provided for her entire life." "Provided what?" I asked, before I could stop myself. Silence. Heather blinked. "A home. Stability." I glanced at the door. "The home was never his," I said quietly. Dad's jaw tightened. "You're twisting this." "No," Grandpa replied calmly. "She's clarifying it." Maddie took a step back, physically distancing herself from the tension. "I didn't know," she murmured. And for the first time that night, I believed her. Dad looked around the foyer, scanning faces that once reflected admiration. Now, they reflected something else. Uncertainty. Mr. Hayes closed the briefcase with a quiet snap. "The trustee will formally review occupancy rights within 30 days, he said. "Until then, all parties are expected to conduct themselves in the beneficiary's best interest." Beneficiary. The word felt surreal. Dad stared at me like I had betrayed him by existing. "So what?" he said bitterly. "You're going to throw us out?" I met his gaze. "I didn't throw anyone out tonight." The symmetry landed. Heather's composure cracked just enough for panic to surface. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "we need to talk. Not about me. About them. About what shifted." Grandpa turned slightly toward me. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said quietly. "But you do need to choose where you stand." I looked at the foyer, at the dining table beyond it, at the half-eaten plates, at the seat that had never existed for me. I looked at my father. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had always assumed he controlled the narrative and suddenly didn't. "Avery," he said again, softer now. "You're overreacting." That word again. Overreacting. The universal dismissal. I felt something settle inside me, not anger, clarity. "I asked for respect," I said. "You told me to earn it outside." He didn't respond. Grandpa's voice was calm, steady. "You don't teach respect through humiliation." The sentence wasn't loud, but it carried. Heather turned toward Dad, her voice low and urgent. "You told me this house was yours." Dad didn't answer her. Maddie's eyes widened. "You told us that." The collapse wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just the slow unraveling of certainty. Dad straightened again, trying to reclaim control through tone. "We'll handle this internally," he said. "There's no need for further involvement." Grandpa nodded once. "I agree." Dad looked relieved for half a second. Then Grandpa added, "The trustee will be in contact tomorrow." Relief evaporated. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Not because anyone yelled, but because the foundation had changed. I felt the weight of the moment pressing in. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit this house, made myself smaller, quieter, more agreeable. And now the structure itself was bending around me. Grandpa extended his hand again, not insistently, just patiently. Would you like to come home with me tonight? Home. The word landed differently this time. Dad's voice cut in quickly. Avery, don't be dramatic. You live here. Live here. Not own. Not belong. Just reside. I looked past him at the dining table one last time. At the empty space where my place card had never been. Then I looked at the Rolls Royce at the curb. At the man who had never stopped sending letters I never received. At the truth that had arrived quietly and refused to be denied. I think, I said slowly, I'll go with Grandpa. The sentence didn't explode. It didn't need to. It simply ended something. Dad stared at me as if I had stepped off a cliff. You're making a mistake, he said. No, I replied gently. I'm making a choice. Grandpa placed his hand lightly at the small of my back, not directing, not pushing, just steadying. Heather stepped aside first. Maddie didn't speak. Mrs. Thompson watched with something that almost looked like approval. Dad stood in the doorway as we stepped past him. The door he had closed on me 15 minutes earlier remained open now. But I wasn't walking through it. I walked down the porch steps instead. The Rolls-Royce door opened smoothly. As I slid into the seat, I looked back once. Dad was still standing there. Not shouting, not threatening, just staring at the space I had vacated. For the first time in years, I wasn't outside. He was. The Rolls-Royce door closed with a soft, decisive sound. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just final. The warmth inside the car felt different from the warmth of the house I had just left. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't performative. It was steady, intentional. Grandpa sat beside me, not speaking at first. He didn't rush to fill the silence with comfort or commentary. He simply gave me space to breathe. As the car pulled away from Willow Ridge Drive, I watched my father's figure shrink in the side mirror. The house didn't look different, but I did. We drove for several minutes before Grandpa spoke. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I exhaled slowly. I don't know. That's an honest answer. I stared down at my hands in my lap. They weren't shaking anymore. I didn't know about the trust, I admitted. I know, he said gently. Why didn't you tell me? He looked out the window briefly before answering. I tried. The words settled between us. 72 letters? I asked. 72 documented returns, Mr. Hayes corrected softly from the front seat. There were more attempts that didn't come back with proof. I swallowed. For 12 years? Grandpa nodded once. I hired investigators twice, he said. Your father moved addresses, changed contact details. He made it difficult. Why didn't you show up like this before? I asked. Not accusing, just trying to understand. Grandpa didn't hesitate. Because I had to be certain, he said. Certainty protects you. Emotion doesn't. The car turned onto the main road. Streetlights passing rhythmically across the windows. Did you know he told me you didn't want me? I asked quietly. Grandpa's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I assumed. Silence fell again. I believed him, I said. I know. The simplicity of that response made something in my chest ache. We drove another mile before Grandpa added, You were a child. Children believe what they're told. I leaned back against the leather seat. What happens now? I asked. Mr. Hayes answered this time. The trustee will formally initiate review tomorrow morning. Your father will receive written notice. And then? Then the trust evaluates occupancy rights. Grandpa glanced at me. And you decide what feels safe. Safe. The word felt unfamiliar but welcome. When we pulled into Grandpa's driveway 20 minutes later, I felt something loosen in my shoulders. His house wasn't extravagant. It wasn't ostentatious. It was old brick, with warm light spilling from the windows and a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. It felt lived in. He opened the door himself and gestured me inside. "No performances here," he said lightly. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and coffee. I stood in the foyer for a moment, unsure of what to do with my hands. "You don't have to talk tonight," Grandpa said. "You don't have to decide anything tonight." I nodded. Mr. Hayes placed the briefcase on the entry table. "I'll coordinate the paperwork in the morning," he said. "Rest." When he left, the house grew quiet. Grandpa led me into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. He handed one to me without a word. I sat at the wooden table, staring at the condensation forming along the glass. "I keep thinking he's going to call," I admitted. "He probably will," Grandpa said calmly. "And if he apologizes?" Grandpa leaned back slightly. "Apologies don't erase patterns," he said, "but they can signal change. The question is whether you believe in that change." I stared down at the table. "I don't hate him," I whispered. "I wouldn't expect you to. I just don't trust him." Grandpa nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable boundary." The word boundary felt powerful, not rebellious, not cruel, just defined. My phone buzzed on the table. "Dad." I stared at the screen. It buzzed again. And again. 3 calls in less than a minute. I didn't answer. Another message came through. "We need to talk. This isn't how families handle things." I showed the screen to Grandpa. He didn't react emotionally. He simply asked, "What do you need right now?" Not what does he need. Not what will look good. "What do you need?" "I need quiet," I said. "Then take it." I turned the phone face down. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed someone immediate access to my attention. Grandpa stood and walked toward a hallway. "There's a guest room upstairs," he said. "It's not temporary unless you want it to be." The words caught me off guard. "Not temporary?" "You don't have to return anywhere that diminishes you," he said simply. The simplicity of it nearly broke me. I stood slowly. Before heading upstairs, I paused. "Grandpa?" "Yes? Thank you for coming." He studied me for a moment. "I didn't come for the house," he said. "I came for you." Upstairs, the guest room window overlooked a small garden. The bed was neatly made. A folded blanket rested at the foot. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let the night settle around me. My phone buzzed again downstairs. And again. And again. But for once, the sound didn't pull me toward it. I lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. The house on Willow Ridge Drive would still be there tomorrow. The paperwork would still be real. The truth would still exist. But tonight, I wasn't standing outside a door. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was procedural, which, in some ways, was more unsettling. The next morning, Grandpa made coffee at 6:30 like he always did. No tension, no frantic phone calls, just the steady rhythm of someone who understood that truth doesn't need theatrics to hold its ground. My phone, however, disagreed. 14 missed calls, 7 texts, 2 voicemails. I listened to the first one. "Avery," Dad's voice said, controlled but strained. "We need to talk. You blindsided me." Blindsided. The word almost made me laugh. The second voicemail was softer. "I lost my temper. That's all. You know I get stressed." The third shifted tone again. "Don't let him divide this family." I turned the phone off. Grandpa watched me from across the kitchen table. "You don't have to respond today," he said. "I don't think I want to respond at all," I admitted. "That's your choice." Choice. It still felt new in my hands. By mid-morning, Mr. Hayes arrived with formal documents. Calm, efficient, unemotional. "The trust review is in motion," he explained. "Your father has 30 days to demonstrate that remaining in the property aligns with your best interests." "And if it doesn't?" I asked. "Then alternative arrangements are made." Alternative arrangements. It sounded clean. Not revenge. Not eviction in anger. Just a consequence. News travels quickly in Brookhaven. By noon, I had 3 messages from acquaintances asking if everything was okay. Mrs. Thompson left a short voicemail. "I'm glad someone stood up for you," she said quietly. I hadn't realized until then how visible that night had been. But visibility didn't scare me anymore. 3 days later, Dad sent a different kind of message. "I'm sorry. I handled it poorly. I didn't think you'd leave." I stared at the screen for a long time. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. Finally, I wrote, "I didn't leave. I was told to stand outside. I didn't send it." Instead, I put the phone down and went for a walk through Grandpa's garden. He joined me a few minutes later, hands behind his back. "You're thinking," he observed. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like," I said. "It looks different for everyone," he replied. "Does it mean going back? No. Does it mean pretending it didn't happen? Absolutely not." I stopped walking. "Then what does it mean?" Grandpa looked out over the hedge line before answering. "It means you decide how much access someone has to you moving forward. Access. Not love. Not obligation. Access." I let that sink in. Over the next 2 weeks, the paperwork moved steadily. Grandpa never gloated, never raised his voice, never once said, "I told you so." Dad requested a meeting. This time, I agreed. Not at Willow Ridge Drive, at a neutral cafe downtown. He arrived early. I could tell by the way he sat back straight, hands folded on the table like he was preparing for negotiation. "You look well," he said when I approached. "I am," I replied. We sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I never meant to hurt you," he said finally. "I know," I answered. He looked surprised. "I just meant to maintain order." "There's a difference," I said quietly, "between order and control." He didn't argue. "I thought I was teaching you resilience. You were teaching me silence." The words hung between us. He looked older than I remembered. "I didn't think you'd challenge me in front of everyone," he said. "I didn't think you'd lock me out," I replied gently. He nodded once. "I shouldn't have done that." No, the simplicity of it mattered. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. We didn't erase 12 years. But we redefined something important. "I need space," I told him. "Not punishment, not drama, just space." He nodded slowly. "I can give you that." It wasn't redemption. It was a beginning. 30 days later, the trust review concluded. The house legally remained under the trust's authority. Dad and Heather chose to relocate to a smaller property across town. No spectacle. No public collapse. Just paperwork. On the afternoon they finished moving out, I stood inside 14 Willow Ridge Drive for the first time without feeling like a guest. The air felt the same. The walls looked the same. But the silence was different. Grandpa walked in behind me, hands in his coat pockets. "You don't have to keep it," he said. "You don't have to live here." I looked around slowly. The dining room, the foyer, the front door. "I don't think I want it," I said after a moment. He nodded, unsurprised. "Then we'll sell it." And just like that, the house stopped being a symbol. It became an asset. The following December, Grandpa and I decorated a modest tree in his living room. No guest list. No performances. No place cards. Just 2 mugs of cocoa and soft music in the background. I stood by the window that evening, watching snow settle gently on the garden. Grandpa joined me. "Cold out there," he observed. "Yeah," I said. He studied me quietly. "But you're not outside anymore." I smiled. "No," I agreed. "I'm not." After everything, I learned something I wish I'd known years earlier. Respect isn't taught through humiliation. It isn't earned by shrinking yourself. And it doesn't come from fear. Respect is modeled. It's steady. It leaves the door open. That night, as snow touched the glass, I realized something else. The most powerful moment wasn't when the Rolls-Royce arrived. It wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't even the confrontation. It was the second I understood that I didn't have to stand where I was placed. I could move. And for the first time in my life, I chose the warm side of the glass.